There's a number that matters before I tell you anything else about Jose. 100 milliamps. That's approximately how much alternating current it takes to trigger ventricular fibrillation in a healthy adult heart. 100 milliamps. For reference, the current flowing through a standard 40-watt light bulb is more than 3 times that. The difference between a functioning cardiac rhythm and complete hemodynamic collapse, measured in electricity, is smaller than most people realize. Jose was a line technician for a utility company in the Southwest, 11 years on the job. He worked primary distribution infrastructure, the lines you drive under without thinking, the ones that feed neighborhood transformers, the segments of the grid that someone has to physically maintain. He was 41 years old. He described his belief system, when I asked him about it directly, the way engineers sometimes describe things that seem obvious to them, patiently, without contempt, as if the framework was simply there and had always been there. The universe was a physical system operating on knowable principles. Consciousness was what a functioning brain produced. What some people called the soul was what a neuroscientist called an emergent property of neural complexity. He'd read enough of the literature to know the terms. He wasn't hostile about it. He just didn't see the gaps that other people said they saw. On a Tuesday morning in February of 2017, he climbed a utility pole to service a section of 12-kilovolt primary distribution line. The line had been logged in the work order as de-energized. It wasn't. The contact lasted approximately 2/3 of a second. At that voltage and frequency, alternating current does something very specific when it finds a path across the thorax. It doesn't stop the heart, not directly, not at first. It induces ventricular fibrillation by depolarizing the cardiac myocytes simultaneously across the entire myocardium. Every cell fires. None of them coordinate. The heart quivers instead of contracting. Blood pressure drops to 0 in approximately 4 seconds. He fell from the pole. His safety harness arrested the fall. He hung there, unconscious, in ventricular fibrillation. His foreman was a man named Marcus, 27 years working power lines. He called 911 before he reached the base of the pole, and he started CPR on the ground within approximately 90 seconds of the contact. EMS arrived just under 6 minutes from the call. 3 shocks. The third one converted him. He was without a perfusing rhythm for approximately 4 minutes. 2 days later, when Jose woke up in the ICU, the first coherent thing he said was not about himself. He asked whether Marcus had been able to reach his wife before the ambulance came. He knew Marcus had made 2 calls, the first to 911, the second to a contact in his phone labeled Emergency Rosa. He described Marcus walking from the base of the pole to the cab of the truck to make that second call, while another crew member remained on the ground with Jose. Marcus confirmed it. He had been unconscious, suspended in a harness, 22 feet off the ground. Marcus had been at the base of the pole with his back to the truck when he made those calls. Jose was facing the wrong direction. None of the clinical circumstances account for how he knew the sequence. I've sat with that detail for longer than I've sat with some of the more dramatic pieces of evidence in this field. It's not dramatic. That's what makes it difficult to put inside any of the boxes I was trained to use. Let me tell you what happened in those 4 minutes. Jose described the separation the way he described everything, methodically, with attention to sequence and physical detail. He was looking down from above. He described the color of Marcus's hard hat. He described the exact configuration of the equipment laid out at the base of the pole, which was not the standard layout, because one of the cable drums had been repositioned that morning for clearance. 2 crew members confirmed the repositioning independently when they were asked about it separately, weeks later. And then, he was somewhere else. He tried to describe the transition several times across our conversations, and each time he found the same problem. Every spatial metaphor was wrong. It wasn't arrival. It wasn't movement. It was more like a condition he had been in, without knowing it, which had suddenly become apparent. He used the word vast first, and then corrected himself. Vast implies something large with edges. What he described had no edge. It wasn't dark. It wasn't bright in the way you shield your eyes from brightness. It had its own light, not directed from anywhere, just present, the way warmth is present in a room before you've located where it's coming from. He paused for a long moment when I first asked him to describe what came next. Then the review. He said this part carefully, because he was an engineer and structure mattered to him. The life review in near-death experience accounts is almost always described as non-chronological, simultaneous, panoramic, everything at once. His was that. But what he could articulate most clearly was how it was weighted. Not by duration, not by consequence in the way he would have measured consequence before, career, outcome, what you built or didn't build. By impact on another person at the specific moment the impact landed. He saw himself at a construction site in his late 20s. A brief exchange with a laborer named Ernesto, a man he had worked alongside for nearly 3 years, spoken to maybe a dozen times, someone he had never thought of as a significant relationship. In the review, this exchange occupied more space than entire years of Jose's life. He reconstructed it afterward, tried to time it. 37 seconds. He had no memory of it before the review. He hadn't known it existed until he was shown it. What he saw in the review was what Ernesto had been carrying that week and what those 37 seconds had meant to him at exactly the moment they were needed. Jose had not known any of that. He had not planned the exchange. He had not deliberated over what to say. He had simply said something true, briefly, to a man he barely knew, and immediately forgotten it. In the review, the weight it carried was the weight of what it meant to the person who received it. He saw other moments too, the ones he might have expected to see, from a different direction. Times he had been too efficient to be fully present. Times he had moved past something without stopping for it. He saw those without flinching, he said, and this was the part he kept returning to across all of our conversations. What held the review was not judgment, not examination, not assessment. It was recognition. The quality of being completely known by something that had apparently always known him and was showing him what he had been carrying without him fully understanding the weight of it. Then a presence. He didn't describe a figure. He described something that was aware of him the way warmth is aware of a cold room, not through an act, not through a decision, simply through what happens when those two conditions occupy the same space. The awareness didn't exclude anything he had done or failed to do. It included all of it. And the quality of that inclusion was not what he had been bracing for, which was nothing. It was the farthest thing from nothing he had ever experienced. He asked it, not in words, why the review was weighted the way it was, why 37 seconds with a near stranger had more gravity than entire years. The answer he received was also not in words. He understood it anyway. The weight, he told me, was in what a moment meant to someone who needed it, at the exact time they needed it. Not what it cost the person giving it, what it meant to the person receiving it. He came back. He doesn't have a complete account of why, just that at a certain point the weight of what he had left became as specific as the weight of where he was. His daughter. She was 12. He came back for the specificity of that. He told me later that the decision was made before he was fully conscious. When he woke in the ICU and asked about Rosa, he already knew he wasn't going back to the lines. It took 3 days to say it out loud, not because he was uncertain, but because he was still learning what the words meant. He sat in the kitchen at home with his daughter. She brought him coffee and sat next to him without asking questions, which he said was exactly what he needed. On the 3rd day, he told her he couldn't go back. She thought he meant the lines. He meant the entire design of the life he had been building. He retrained. 2 years of coursework. He works now in hospice volunteer coordination, direct patient contact, sitting with people in their last days, particularly people with no family to sit with them. He said to me, "I know what it means to someone on the other side of a moment when that moment is what they needed. I'd rather spend whatever time I have trying to produce those moments than calculating how efficiently I can close out the ones I'm already in. Michael Sabom was a cardiologist at Emory University who spent years doing something that made colleagues uncomfortable. He treated near-death experience accounts as clinical data worth examining rigorously. His 1982 book, Recollections of Death, documented a controlled study. He took cardiac arrest patients who reported NDEs that included out-of-body observations of their own resuscitation, and he compared their accounts against a control group, cardiac patients who had been told what resuscitation typically looks like and asked to describe it. The control group described what they imagined. The NDE group described what was actually there, the specific configuration of equipment, the positions of the team, details that varied by the particular circumstances of that resuscitation, things that hadn't been described in any briefing because they weren't standardized. What Marcus confirmed about the cable drum and the phone calls is in that category. Kenneth Ring spent 40 years at the University of Connecticut studying what near-death experiences do to the people who have them. One of the most consistent findings in his longitudinal research was the direction of transformation. Post-NDE subjects moved the same way. Decreased concern with status and material achievement, increased concern with relationships, with direct compassionate action, with what he called the small things that carry real weight. This direction was not predicted by the content of the specific experience. It was not predicted by prior religious belief or the absence of it. Atheists who had near-death experiences transformed in the same direction as lifelong believers who had near-death experiences. The experience recalibrated the same thing in people who had entered it from completely opposite frameworks. Jose recalibrated in 3 days. He told me later that it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like finally understanding what the instrument was for. Here's where I need to be honest about where my own framework fails. Not metaphorically, specifically. In the 4 years since my surgery, I've built the most careful materialist account of near-death experience that I can construct and sustain. I need it. I was trained to need things to hold under scrutiny. The account works reasonably well for cardiac arrest cases. The brain goes hypoxic. There are documented effects of hypoxia on perceptual processing. The temporal lobe has known spontaneous activation patterns under acute physiological stress. These mechanisms don't fully explain veridical content, but they're mechanisms. There's a logic to follow. Electrocution doesn't produce the same physiological sequence. High-voltage alternating current causes ventricular fibrillation through direct effect on the myocardium. The brain goes hypoxic as a downstream consequence, but the initial insult is peripheral, not cerebral. The pathway is different, and in a case where resuscitation is as rapid as Marcus managed, the window of cerebral hypoxia may be shorter than in a standard cardiac arrest. The mechanism through which the hypoxic hallucination argument operates has less time to operate, and yet what Jose described is what cardiac arrest patients describe, what drowning survivors describe, what trauma patients describe. The mechanism of physiological crisis changes. The content does not change. I've looked at this from the direction I was trained to look. The account doesn't close cleanly around all of it. What eventually closes, not the argument but something else, is the need for it to close at all. Jose sat in his kitchen for 3 days. He came out knowing that 37 seconds with a man named Ernesto had carried more weight than either of them had any way of knowing at the time. He came out knowing that the scale measuring moments is not the one he had been taught to read. He left a 12-kilovolt line job to sit with dying strangers. I don't have a framework that fully accounts for how he got from one to the other. I've looked for one. I keep looking, but I know what kind of accounting produces that result. And I know it's not the kind he used to run.